Hi, you're listening to Collectively Speaking by the Birthday Collective, a bottom-up initiative to develop ideas about Singapore's future. Welcome to this space, where Birthday Book alumni have conversations about the things that matter to them, to us, and to Singapore. We hope that you will be a part of the many conversations we will have, or perhaps to even start your own. And now, onward with the episode.
Welcome to Collectively Speaking. We're Eddie and Aaron, your hosts for today's episode on the future. And we have today as our guests Eng Teck, Mariam Aljunied, and Cheryl Chung. All of them wrote essays on different aspects of the future in different editions of the Birthday Book. And I thought we'd start, with all three of you. If you could tell us a bit about your essay, why you wrote it, and how it deals with this theme, the future. Eng Teck, can we start with you?
Sure. When I was sitting down to think about my essay, I didn't want it to be either optimistic or pessimistic. I wanted to because of my Buddhist upbringing, I wanted to have a more natural take on what happens if I look at history and take all historical forces and stretch it out into the future. So then I asked myself that question: what would happen if all socioeconomic forces go forward 100 years?
Okay. And what kind of conclusions did you reach?
I find that whenever capital owners reach a certain tipping point, they get to a position in any society, in any civilization, where they become very divorced from the majority of a population. And it lets capital owners have a lot of free rein over how they decide the future and the progress, the direction of the future and the progress in any society. So then I ask myself, given the perennial conditions we know about Singapore, its geography, its history, what would happen to us? How would we stretch that future out? Yeah.
Right. Okay. Mariam, let's turn to you for a bit. What was your essay about, and why did you choose to write that?
My essay was actually a letter to my daughter on her 21st birthday. So it was quite fortuitous. It was her 21st birthday, a big deal for her and me. And it was also soon after the SG50. And I think my family had, not the only one, but I think there was a lot of effort in putting together narratives of the families in Singapore that's been around for 200 years. So I wrote the letter to her, and basically the key ideas of the letter is to look back, have an insight back to the past, but gaining from that lessons that we can bring for the future. And the whole idea being that, yes, it's important to look at the past to know where we come from, but the value of that is not simply about nostalgia, but rather the real value of looking back to the past is to see how it can help us navigate the future.
Okay. And what would you say are one or two insights about how exactly we can navigate the future?
In the letter, for example, I talked about how when we look at our historical past, we have a historical connection, but emotionally, we cannot be stuck in the past. Emotionally, it's actually the present. So it's connecting back to our own identity, where we come from, the tribe that historically we're connected to, but really getting into terms that the tribe that we are connected with emotionally is actually the here and now. So I think that constant connection between the past and the present, and connecting the meaning rather than the actual concrete things of the past, and which if we do indulge in that too much, we might get stuck in the past and therefore not able to move forward.
Right. So past, present, and future all as one continuum, actually.
That's right.
Yeah. Cheryl, tell us about your essay.
Yeah, so I wrote an essay called Stories of a Smart Nation for our first book, written to the theme of Singapore's next big thing. And actually, I was inspired by a photo, and this is the photo that I introduced in the beginning of the essay, which is by an astronaut in the International Space Station, and he takes this wonderful photo of Singapore at the nighttime, and you can see the whole of Singapore in a single shot. And for me, it was such an evocative image of, Singapore is seen in a glance, but at the same time, as a Singaporean, being potentially one of those little lights that you see in the night sky, trying to figure out where your place is, in this future and this smart nation. So my essay focused very much on a particular set of trends that actually I looked at in my professional life, data and smart nation and kind of Internet of Things and what does it mean for society and that kind of thing. But really reflecting on the other hand, of my own role as a citizen, as an individual, and what my place is in that. So that was my starting point for my essay.
It sounds like you went into the deeply micro from a very macro view.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Cool. You know, I'm struck by all three of your descriptions because a lot of times the future reinforces the past, but sometimes it also forces us to kind of re-examine our assumptions, re-examine our biases. And I'm wondering, since each of you wrote your essays, what has been reinforced for you and what have you changed your mind about? Eng Teck, can we start with you?
Yeah, because I wrote my essay in 2017, way back then we didn't really look at Cambridge Analytica. We haven't not looked at data privacy really seriously. It was only in the past 3 years that data privacy and what it means for a small number of organizations to pretty much own the information pertaining to every individual came about in the world. That I realized that we are living in an era in which we are influenced by forces that we are simply unaware about. And right now, what I think is that we will now move forward into a future where a lot of our decisions from the time in which we were kids till now would have been shaped by capital owners in a way that, pretty much predetermines a lot of our thinking. Maybe not the decisions and choices that we make, maybe not like specific purchases to be made, right? But the overall direction of our thoughts and of society as a whole would be shaped by them.
Okay.
Yeah, not so much of like nanobots and androids.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Mariam, what's been reinforced or have you changed your mind about?
Yeah, I think I have one thing that get reinforced and one thing that somehow rather make me feel not so much change, but rather, I think it wasn't so simple. Reading it now, I can't help but look back on the current lens and the current lens that we have right now with all the pandemic and the current situation. So I can't help look at the essay now with that particular lens. And one thing struck me is really my experience right now. And what matters most on the situation currently, day-to-day living, is the importance of neighbors. And in my letter to my daughter, I talked about how important our ancestors were. Sheikh Umar, the first Arab in Singapore, included how his neighbors was the most important people for him, whoever they were. They were Chinese and Eurasians, and that became his closest connection. And in fact, the historical fact is that they actually saved his life at one point. And then my daughter's experience, whereby she and our neighbor in Sims Drive, had a very personal contact. So again, in the COVID situation, you have families all over, but who is the person that you rely on and you really are closest to you and for basic life? Like, is this actually your neighbors? So that really reinforces it. A simple fact that I think we often forget. The thing that, and reading my essay, that there was one part that I reminded my daughter about the St. Andrew's Cathedral, which is originally the land belonged to Mariam Aljunied, my ancestor, and he donated it to the British, knowing that it's going to be allocated for the Anglican community. And I remembered and I told her that I once have this conversation with my late dad, and I asked him because I can imagine today how contentious that was. And I was trying, and people asked, oh, how can he do that, this and that. And I remembered what he told me is that, God is important to you. Yeah, God is important to others too. Why is it so difficult to understand the simple fact? So I put it as a simple truth. But my word, in the last few years, I've had conversations with people, not so simple, And ironically, I find that when people, we have a lot of conversations about let's get to know each other's differences, and that tend to generate a lot of interest. But the challenge I find is that the minute we get to know each other and find out about beyond the curiosity, it is the most difficult thing is not to see the differences as hierarchical. Well, the drive to see, okay, so you are. Let's take example myself. I mean, I have the Arab heritage, I have the Malay heritage. And depending on who I speak with, the fine line between embracing both and then became a chauvinism of, which one is higher than the other? It is the Arab or it is the Malay? it's so subtle, but it's so it's intuitive in a scary way. So I think I just had that one line, simple truth. I think I would add a few more paragraphs now.
You could write a whole second essay, actually, right?
Yeah.
We'll keep it in mind if we need to do a sequel at any point. Because what you're describing is very important for multicultural societies, I think, in particular. Yeah. Cheryl?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, it's always interesting reading things you wrote a few years ago. I think for me, one of the things that was reinforced was really this idea. They say history is written by the winners, and in some way the future is also written by the winners. And it's this idea of there can be one story which is this macro narrative, grand narrative of the future, and what does that look like? What's this official version of what the future might hold and our collective aspirations. But I think there is another conversation to be had about what are these micro futures. What does the future look like for me as an individual? What does the future look like for people around me? And how our futures might actually be in tension, right? Not everybody is the winner coming from, when the future is disrupted, for example. We see that very clearly in COVID. So I think for me, it's really this question around how to bring out, a more inclusive future, a much more, I'm going to say, open and multiple future. I think that to me has become reinforced. I think in terms of what has changed, and this might reflect a personal change more than the world changing per se. So around the time that I wrote the essay, I was in the early stages of a career shift, and I shifted from a civil servant to become an educator. And I think when you're an educator, you become very invested into individuals thriving in the future. So it's not about policy or strategy. That is all very important, but it's you need to understand policy and strategy for your own thriving and the thriving of your community around you and so on. And I think now being in this field of education is been very interesting to also think through what these individual micro narratives look like and how to help young people really get this agency for their future, that they can write their own micro narratives of the future as well.
That is fascinating because all three of you actually have gone into very deeply individual perspectives. One in Eng Teck's case by looking at very macro trends, in Mariam's case by looking at family, and in Cheryl, in your case, by looking at your students. I think that's a wonderful commonality there. I was wondering if we could take a different turn for a while and maybe explore each of your essays in a bit more depth. For Mariam, you mentioned that you wrote a letter to your daughter on her 21st birthday. Now, this is a very uniquely personal approach to take when doing an essay. What kind of unique perspectives do you think this approach allowed you to explore?
I chose it because it allows me to join the dots between what may be a national or more public narrative to something that is very personal and very intimate, which is my personal experience and her personal experience. So it allows me to have those two connecting lines. And for me, especially when we're thinking about the past and the future and the whole idea about identity and nation building, yes, we can write the national narrative, we can propagate that, but I personally feel that for it to be meaningful, it has to be authentic at the really deeply intimate level. Then it sticks. Otherwise, it becomes a public noise, if you like. Yeah. So it allows me to do that. It allows me to talk about the stories of Mariam Aljunied, and everybody knows whose name is named after an MRT and things like that. Yeah. But at the same time, his legacies that are personal and meaningful to me, right? So it allows me to pick up certain elements of that and forefront that. Because again, when we look at historical facts, there may be stories, and many of these are also oral history. You pick up a few. I like what you said, that future is written by the winners. But at a personal level, whatever the version of it, I think what's most telling is what is the message that you take from it. And I think that's important, right? If you take, for example, the plot of land being donated, you can focus on the legality of that. You can focus on whatever. You can focus on, the law and whether is the British, the state taking over the land. You can focus on that, but I think that tells more about your perspective and your values. Yeah, but I chose to actually focus on the fact that that message about relating the interfaith, the intercultural, and how simple it was then, and as much as I admire that, there's a certain sadness that I feel because how come 200 years ago they got it so right, and we are supposed to be more informed, more clever, more educated, and yet we struggle with that such simple truth. It's humbling for me.
Okay. For Eng Teck, you created an alternative future world, almost like science fiction. What did this approach help you achieve?
I've always liked science fiction because it allows its creators to free themselves from the limitations of the present. So if we look at our mobile devices of today, these were things that appeared in science fiction almost 50 years ago. Some would say even 100 years back in the early science fiction writers. Taking this specific approach lets me shine a light on specific topics and put them together next to each other. What would happen if we took economic specialization to that limit? What would happen if we looked at the current trends in our social emotional distress? People being overworked, people not having rest, not being able to connect with each other, and so on and so forth, right? That was really, really important for me to be able to write freely, in a sense, without being bound by the details of the world that we live in today. So the essay that I was really writing about was not really about androids or about specific technologies, but really more an opportunity for us to examine ourselves as people in relation to how we interact with the world, and to ask ourselves the question, what would happen if that one thing changes? What would happen if we treated our human social workers, with a great deal more dignity? What would happen if we balanced out our work lives a bit more and gave more work equity to people who are unemployed? What would society look like if all of those tiny little bits in the story change? And the smallest changes that we can make now would have an immense impact and disproportionately huge impact in the future that we look at.
Yeah, and Cheryl, you explored the contrast between data and narratives. So how do you think this approach helped you explore the topic?
I think for me, I chose data and narratives as this contrast because that's a contrast that I feel very personally, right? I'm economics trained on the one hand, and I'm an artist and designer on the other hand. So, trying to wrestle with this statistics and, kind of quantitative analysis, and having technical skill in that area, but also knowing that sometimes statistics don't convince anybody to do anything, it's a bit of a tension, right? And when I was exploring particularly this idea of smart nation, I think the conversation at the time, this is 2016, when it was really quite, just starting out, focused very much on this macro story. And very often I would sit on a panel and somebody in the audience will kind of fold their arms and say, oh, but what does it mean for me? And I think that for me was very much the starting point of thinking and using this tension between data and narratives to talk about the future, and specifically in this example, of course, the future of Singapore as a smart nation. I would also say that in foresight work, scenarios are just a fancy word for stories, are such an important device, for all of us talking about the future, right? Again, I can give you a set of PowerPoint slides on macroeconomic trends, and it doesn't have that same agency, I think, right? That motivation to help you see your place in the future and be motivated to work towards a better future. I think it doesn't, I think there's a role for stories and storytelling in that particular space. And I think what Eng Teck and Mariam have said, in their remarks, has just been so relevant too, right? They've just talked about stories, right? And how stories have been so powerful in their personal lives. And I think that's really amazing.
Yeah, thanks for that, Cheryl. And it's really brilliant that you brought up the point about agency as well, because the next question that we're going to have is about what advice would you give for people who are concerned for their future, for their families, for themselves, for Singapore? What kind of agency would you impart to them, if you will? Mariam, you go first.
Yeah. Again, I can't help but hear the question and think about our current, pandemic situation. And one of the things in my essay, I talk about the collective consciousness. Now we have a collective anxiety, and if we're not careful, that can be actually quite, can make us completely paralyzed. So I think there's a few things I think we can learn. Again, learning from the past. COVID-19 is not really the first global crisis we have. The closest thing we have, and everybody has gone through that, not us, but the country, is actually wars. And I mean, you think about families are very often, even now, worried about, what would this COVID do to my child? How would our children get out of it? Will it affect them long term? There's a lot to be learned about the effects of war on children. And I want to point out just two of it. Interestingly, thankfully, actually the majority of children that undergone war, they are actually okay. They grow up to be fully functioning adults, and I think that speaks to the resiliency of children. But there's another important, quite robust findings, and that for the children to be resilient, they need one consistent caregiver that provides emotional stability. So what does it mean for us? Currently, as we navigate, trying to become stronger together, there's a lot of course, economy is important. I mean, no one doubts that. Of course, industry and education is important, and we need to build up the infrastructure. But all of the things that we assume to do assumes that the parent and caregiver is emotionally available for that child. You can have the best home-based learning equipment, but if the parent is not emotionally available, it does not work, firstly, and that child will never have the stable emotional factor that will make them resilient. That's an extra vulnerable child if the parent is not emotionally available. And I'm wondering whether we pay enough attention to ensure, if we care about children, we need to make sure that the parents are emotionally strong. And I think we need to do more on that. The other thing that I thought, okay, I'm in the presence of poets here, so I got to be careful. Language is very powerful, and the words we use kind of color how we see things. And people are talking about the new normal, right? After hearing a few times, I thought to myself, okay, I have a problem with the new normal. Maybe it's just my perception, but that word kind of describes there is this clear destination called new normal that all of us can imagine, and then let's try figure it out. So it becomes almost like an intellectual exercise to describe this new normal. Okay, I'm not so sure that's possible, and whether it's helpful. The reality is that what is it that we know now, and knowing what we know now, we can predict the next normal. So I think I kind of like the term next normal rather than new normal. And at least it gives the assurance that, okay, we base it on what we know now, and then you plan for the next. And then when the next comes, we plan for the next, and so on and so forth. It's helpful for me because I think it's more closer to reality. And secondly, we don't know how things go. I mean, God forbid, if like other countries, there's a second outbreak, the next normal is going to back where we were from. And that's okay if you see it as a next normal. But if you see it as a new normal, as a final destination, I think it can evoke more anxiety and less emotional stability for all of us.
Right. So emotional availability and just thinking of the next step ahead rather than one single destination. Okay. Eng Teck?
I particularly like some of the aspects of what Mariam raised about being grounded in reality and being clear that in spite of us going through a pandemic, in spite of us talking about this new normal, the new normal doesn't mean the same things for all of us, right? The new normal means a completely different thing for a hawker, completely different thing for an office worker, completely different thing for a business owner. And for me, it is really important to remember that in spite of how technology might progress, in spite of whether there might be any unexpected, global catastrophes, right? Some things don't change. The fact that we need human connection, we need a meaning in our lives for the experiences that we put ourselves through to matter, These things speak to the fundamental nature of who we are as living, breathing creatures that coexist, not in a hierarchy, not in some sort of purely conceptual and very brainy idea, but as a part of this planet that we call Earth. And it is therefore really important, I think, for people to take this chance to take a step back for a moment or two and to ask themselves, yes, this might be a pandemic and people have lost their jobs, but what is it that we really care about? And then to ground themselves in that certainty, and to move onwards from that. And this is why I think, even though in spite of the uncertainty, in spite of job losses, people are still finding new ways to connect with each other across distances, right? Having Zoom lunches, making regular WhatsApp calls to reach out, to let their loved ones know that we might be trapped in our homes, but hey, we can find a future ahead together.
So emotional connection and thinking about being grounded in some emotional realities and moving forward together. That's cool. Cheryl, what advice?
Yeah, when you first asked the question, then this textbook answer kind of like flashes in my head, right? And the textbook answer is to say, well, if you want to understand the future better, then you really should be thinking about trends. You should try to understand what these, big geopolitical shifts are and what these technology developments are, then you should go undertake these analyses to think about the impacts and implications, develop these strategy maps. And there's one side of me that thinks that, well, these are important professional skills to have. But I think fundamentally it still comes down to how do we create safe space to talk about and consider these issues of the future. Because at its most fundamental is really engaging in this what-if thinking, which many times we find very challenging, right? Because what-if thinking kind of makes you question your identity, makes you, kind of maybe take in uncertainties that you were not comfortable taking in, facing realities that you might not have planned for, and so on. I think we can go a long way in creating this kind of psychological safety and creating this safe space to ask these what-if questions, because it gives us this opportunity to dress rehearse the future. And I think that again can go quite a long way in terms of addressing this collective anxiety, I think, that we all feel, right? And this kind of finding I'm going to say productive or constructive collective anxiety coping mechanisms, and is there a technology that is more sophisticated than shared conversation? I'm not sure, to really just talk about what our hopes, our dreams, our fears, our futures could look like, and to have that mutual respect, to be able to just honor everybody's lived experience, right? And that we all have different experiences, but there is enough space for all of us to have these micro futures as well.
Right. So shared spaces and the emotional safety to ask those very difficult what-if questions. All right. So it looks like the future is going to be about how we're going to get through this together, emotionally connected together. So that's all the time that we have here today. Thank you. Thanks, Mariam. Thanks, Eng Teck. And thanks, Cheryl. And that's both of us, Aaron and Eddie, hosting today's episode.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Collectively Speaking by the Birthday Collective. We aim to be a brain, heart, and hand trust for Singapore, focusing on the gifts we can offer to future generations. To find out more, visit our website at thebirthdaycollective.com and follow us on Instagram and Facebook at The Birthday Collective. If you enjoyed this episode, Do subscribe and drop us a review.